right, welcome back to History 121, and today we're going to talk about the 70s. We're going to skip forward in time a little bit. We're need to make up some time to cover some material before the end of the week, seeing as this is the last week of classes. And so today we're going to talk about Jimmy Carter, the world of disco, and how the Middle East reared its ugly head in the 70s going into the 1980s. Following Nixon's resignation because of Watergate, Gerald Ford became the first non-elected man to ever serve as President of the United States. He took power in 1974, and 2 years later, he faced Jimmy Carter for the election of 1976 for the presidency of the United States. Ford really didn't have a chance. Ford had been unpopular. A lot of this stems from the fact that he almost immediately pardoned Nixon, so that Nixon never faced any legal repercussions for Watergate and his involvement. Ford had done this as a means of, as he said, healing the nation's wounds, bringing us all back together. And unfortunately, what it did is it almost immediately made him seem like a patsy for the Nixon administration. If you add this together with the satire of Ford on Saturday Night Live, you can find all sorts of YouTube clips of Ford being a klutz and falling down stairs everywhere and just being seen as a non-effectual president, despite a long service in Congress. Gerald Ford really didn't have a chance. Part of this is because Jimmy Carter, his opponent, was seen as a political outsider. He was governor of Georgia at the time. He was a U.S. Navy veteran. He was actually one of the first nuclear engineers in this nation. He served on the first wave of nuclear submarines that the United States Navy had. Part of the reason that he is battling cancer today is because there was a period of time where there was the beginnings of a nuclear incident on one of these submarines, and Jimmy Carter went in and, as commanding officer of his group, could have sent sailors in to repair this and stayed outside. He led by example and went in first and took his doses of radiation, just like the other men assigned with preventing this potential meltdown in a subreactor. And so he's a brave man. He was a good governor. He was a peanut farmer, which was held against him by the Republicans. His brother Billy was also seen as both an asset and a liability. Billy wasn't a politician. Billy was a good old boy. Billy was seen as your typical Georgia Southerner, and everything was, Billy was a redneck. There's no real nice way of saying that. So there were people who said that Billy, being the way he was, showed a tie to the common man that Jimmy Carter still had, because this was a member of his family. And yet there were other people who saw Billy Carter as a buffoon, as a beer-swilling good old boy who was a negative aspect for Carter in his campaign for president. The other problem that Carter faced, it's going to sound really odd in today's age with the current political leadership that we have. Jimmy Carter did an interview in 1976 with Playboy magazine. And Playboy does actually have good articles to read, and it does have good journalism, or it's had a tradition of that in the past. In this interview, Carter, who is a born-again evangelical Christian, did confess to having lustful thoughts for women. He never acted on them. He never did anything. He was always loyal to his wife, but he said that he had sinned in his heart. And because of this, people kind of looked on him as being a little kooky. I mean, you could probably say that almost every person in this country has had lustful feelings in their heart, but it's something that his religious beliefs were hard for some Americans to cue into because, you know, the American people weren't used to a president saying, I'm a bad person just because I've had bad thoughts and that I've tried to make myself better. So in some ways, it's Carter's honesty that was so odd for people to take. Carter is going to face a lot of economic issues in the late 70s. Personally, he brings an opposition to what we call pork barrel spending. And essentially, what this was is in order to get legislation passed, congressmen and senators would attach pork, what was termed pork, or extra unnecessary spending measures that benefited specific people or specific districts in order to buy their votes. He'll have conflicts because of his opposition to pork barrel spending with Congress. He'll also have, he's dealing with a stagnant economy. That began actually in the Nixon administration because of Vietnam and other means. And he'll have conflicts with Congress on how to fix the American economy. The biggest issue that they face early on is something called stagflation. And it's something that you may have heard this term come up in the wake of the 2008 economic downturn, that people were afraid that we were going to see stagflation again. What stagflation is a period of high interest rates, high unemployment, high inflation. So there's high because of inflation, the dollar isn't worth as much, and there's not a lot of economic development going on. At the same time, we also see a lot of taxpayer revolts starting across the country. And by taxpayer revolts, prior to the 1970s, it was just understood that you may not like taxes, but it was your civic duty to pay them. And beginning in the 70s, we start having people that say, hey, you know what? I don't have any kids in school, so I'm not going to vote for property tax increases that are going to benefit the local schools because that's going to hurt my pocket. I don't want to pay any extra taxes because I just want my money. I don't care about what tax money actually goes for in the community. So honestly, the Tea Party and a lot of what we saw in the 2012 and 2016 elections and what we see in the really right-wing conservatives today began as an ideology in the 1970s. Carter is also going to be very unpopular because he will sign a treaty that ended American control of the Panama Canal. You're going to look at this and say, well, big deal. Why does this matter? The Panama Canal was built as a means to allow ease of access between the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. Without the Panama Canal, you have to sail around the continent of South America. America had been successful in sponsoring and building the canal after the French had failed. And the Americans had controlled the canal from the 19 teens when it was completed to the 1970s. In 1999, the canal was given back to Panama. And what this means is essentially if there's a crisis and a crisis of understanding between Panama and the American people, they could deny access to the Panama Canal to the American Navy or American ships, which would make it very difficult for a speedy deployment of the Navy from one hemisphere to the other, It also would see a possible uh, slowing down of American-based shipping from ocean to ocean. So that was a very unpopular move um, by Carter. But Carter did it because he felt that it was the 20th century. America was not supposed to be a colonial power, and so what we could do is we could give up things like control of the Panama Canal as a means to show the rest of the world that we believed in the sovereignty of other nations. All right, so what else is going on besides Jimmy Carter? As I mentioned with the Vietnam lecture, we have a real dissatisfaction with American society and the American government coming out of the Vietnam War, Watergate, and the Nixon administration. And we see a generation born at the end of the Second World War who have serious doubts about the validity of American society, as well as people questioning, honestly, if science and technology is good. This is a period of time where we had children who were born with birth defects because of medicine that had been developed that was supposed to be um, good for the mothers during pregnancy and ultimately caused birth defects or stillbirth or numerous other problems for women. We had questions over nuclear bombs and nuclear energy and pesticides, and we had an incredibly polluted nation. Lake Erie had a nasty habit of catching on fire because of all the petrochemicals that were dumped into it from the manufacturing in northern Ohio. And so we have a generation of people who really question American people, American society, science, our economy. And for some, we see the development of what we call the Back to the Land movement. And it's really easy to call them like dirty hippies and all that stuff and make fun of them. But honestly, these people were so concerned about the environment, they were concerned about the impact of people on the planet, on food, science, and what it was doing, that they volunteered, they voluntarily rejected modern society. And they returned to the land. They returned to what they felt was emblematic of a simpler, better lifestyle that their parents and possibly their grandparents had given up. It was a lifestyle where you didn't, it wasn't a lifestyle based on living in the suburbs and going to work at the factory as middle management and making a paycheck and coming home and owning two cars. It was buying a small farm or a small parcel of land, preferably far away from people, making a minimal environmental impact, building your own home, growing your own food, raising livestock, not large scale farming, but we're talking like 10, 20, 30 acres and making a very hard scrabble existence for yourself. Returning essentially to the agrarian roots of American society. If you're, you can actually still see manifestations of this today, some in the prepper community. There are still back to the landers. There's a youth movement today of people returning to farms, raising backyard chickens, gardening, knitting, making their own clothes, etc. If you go to the grocery store or if you go to Barnes and Noble, if you look in the magazine section, you'll probably find Mother Earth News. That's a publication that started in this period giving advice and how-to information for this back to the land movement about how to live, what crops to grow, how to preserve food. The fact that the magazine is approaching 50 years old is quite a statement, honestly, on its longevity and the longevity of this idea in the American mind. We also, in the 1970s, had the Whole Earth catalog printed, which was a massive catalog, designed for getting information and buying goods that supported this lifestyle. Um, it was supposed to be like free ranging your kids and homeschooling them, and as you can see, knitting your own sweaters and living a more in tune life with the environment. And for several years in the 70s and going into the 80s, we'll see a very successful movement in back to the land, but it will end because it's a hard lifestyle. It's hard not living with air conditioning or television or cable, or growing every ounce of food that you have, and we get used to bathing, and it's there's a downside to the back to the land movement, as romantic as it may seem. We will see the rise of a new musical form that's going to dominate the culture of the late 1970s: disco. If you want to know the impact of disco, listen to Saturday Night Fever. Watch the movie Saturday Night Fever with John Travolta. The Bee Gees do the soundtrack. It is the music of a new dance club scene that is personified by Studio 54 in New York City. It's dancing and sex and drugs and living life to its extreme, because hey, we might actually die. We've got the communists out there. We've got bad economies. So let's just blow at what we have on having a good time. In some ways, disco is the polar opposite of the back to the land movement. It is celebrating the excesses of city life and everything that city life brings with it. There's going to be a massive backlash to disco. Disco will be so popular that it'll supplant rock and roll. We'll see the very beginnings of grunge rock and punk rock as direct backlash against disco. Part of the reason we have a backlash against disco is a music and a dance form that celebrates life in such a way that it draws on deep roots in African American music and African music. And you can see, so if you look up some disco videos, you can see some very extreme themes in the costumes of disco bands. So we have a music that empowers minorities to be a part of daily life. We also have a musical style and a dance club style that empowers homosexuals to be to be open about their lifestyle and to be a part of that dance club scene. And so some of the backlash may very well have been based in racism and homophobia. Some of the backlash may be, in fact, be based in the fact that music in the 70s sucked. As a survivor of the 70s, I can tell you I have some very scarring memories dealing with polyester and high-pitched voices. But it was a real change in pace in what Americans did for entertainment. It was a real departure that, in some ways, in some major cities, allowed for a truly inclusive environment to develop for members of the community that previously had been shunted to the side. In the late 1970s, we start having some severe issues with the Middle East that will affect not just American politics, but American society as a whole. We'll start seeing the rise of radical Islamic beliefs in places like Iran. This is led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is the religious leader who wants to push a purer form of Islam and Islamic belief that is very popular with disaffected or disenfranchised young men in Iranian society. Iran is ruled by the Shah. It is a royalty position. Um, he's essentially the king of Iran. He is backed and supported by the CIA and the American government. Um, it's a corrupt government. It's a government that is not very kind to those who dissent against it. And in 1979, the followers of Khomeini will overthrow the Shah and will go from a despotic or semi-despotic monarchy to a theocratic state. Iran will be run by uh, the Islamic clerics with a titular president to be elected on a cycle, but really the true power behind the state of Iran were the Ayatollahs. The Shah. What doesn't help the situation is the Shah is eventually, after he is deposed, he'll be deposed and he'll immediately flee Iran. Eventually, he will seek refuge in the United States. He'll be granted that refuge because of the need for medical care, also because we had propped him up. And once we allow the Shah in, the Iranians will become. There will be several riots in Iran, and in the capital of Tehran, people loyal to the Ayatollah, radical Islamic believers, will seize the U.S. embassy in response to the Shah being given sanctuary in the United States. 52 Americans from the staff of the embassy will be held hostage for 444 days, more than a year. They will eventually be released, but there will be a failed military attempt to save the hostages and recapture the embassy. American soldiers will die in the desert because of a rushed relief mission that they and their equipment were truly not prepared for. And this is going to seem like a real black mark. Well, this will be a black mark against Carter in a series of events that are really quickly going beyond his control. What people won't know until the late 1990s is that in 1980, the Republican candidate for president, Ronald Reagan, was negotiating with the Ayatollah and the Iranian hostage keepers for the release of the American hostages, but they also were negotiating for when those would be released. And they actually were able to use this behind the scenes as a tool against Carter. They say Carter was a weak president. He's not able to successfully negotiate for our hostages. The military under Carter has failed. And this makes Reagan a better candidate for being president. And with these secret negotiations going on behind the scenes, Reagan will be elected, and on the night that he is sworn in, there will be an announcement at the presidential inaugural ball that the hostages were released, which had been coordinated by people working for Reagan. Dirty politics. We'll have a major energy crisis as well at the end of the 1970s. I have the Malaise speech highlighted here. I'm not able to show it through this medium. I would encourage you to go on YouTube and just Google that term, Malaise speech. Essentially, the Iranian Revolution is going to disturb oil production in the Middle East. The panic caused by the revolution and the disturbance in oil production will drive oil prices out of sight. Now, some people will claim that oil companies were a part of this and actually made things worse by exploiting the situation and possibly artificially driving prices up even higher. In response, gasoline prices, heating oil prices, natural gas prices are going to go through the roof. This is going to impact people by making goods. Everything travels by petroleum-fueled vehicles. Food items, luxury items, day-to-day necessities are going to become more expensive. It's going to be more expensive to drive yourself. It's going to become radically more expensive to heat your house. And in response to this, Carter, who sees himself more as first citizen rather than someone who would rule by fiat or dictate, approaches the American people and tells them, this is a hard time. There are steps we can take. And this may not sound popular, but you're going to have to turn down your thermostat and wear a sweater. Maybe you need to look for an alternative means for heating your living room, like a wood stove. Maybe you should look at installing solar panels in your house. All of these things Carter actually did in the White House. He installed solar panels on the roof. He turned the thermostats down and wore sweaters in the White House in order to be warmer. Carter was leading the American people by example. We're going through a hard time. We will make it because we are Americans and we have always made it. But, you've got to be responsible for yourself. And people didn't like that. People didn't like what could be perceived as preachiness. People didn't like being approached with the, oh yeah, you're responsible for your own actions type of comment. And as such, Carter had to deal with some massive blowback during the energy crisis. He basically was in a position where he lost popularity on a daily basis. The core message of the Malaise speech: in a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but what one owns. But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We've learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence of purpose. The symptoms of this crisis of the American spirit are all around us. For the first time in the history of our country, a majority of our people believe that the next 5 years will be worse than the past 5. 2/3 of our people do not even vote. The productivity of American workers is actually dropping, and the willingness of Americans to save for the future has fallen below that of all other people in the Western world. The word malaise never actually appears in the Malaise speech. But Carter basically, in a period of economic hard times, tells the American people to take a hard look at their lives and that they need to make some personal changes if they want to get better or have better results. And honestly, it's the one thing that people in the late 20th century don't want to hear. They don't want to hear that you've got to save money. They don't want to hear that self-indulgence and consumption are not as important as community and family and work. As we go forward with this class, as you go forward with the weeks after this class, think about what Carter said in his Malaise speech. It cost him the election of 1980, along with the hostage crisis. But I want you to think this, it's not homework, but I want you to think on this. Was Carter wrong? What do you think he would say about American society today?